We visited the Ford Theater historical area in Washington, D.C. in the fall of 2016. If you would like to get notices when I post again, be sure to subscribe right here. Just click on that button. This is the Lincoln Theater National Historic District. Ford's Theater is here, where Lincoln was shot, and the Petersen House, where he died, is across the street. We'll be eating at the Lincoln Waffle House before we go. This theater was opened in 1863, and 2 years later, in April 1865, Lincoln was assassinated in it. It's still an active theater now with many plays. First, we'll take the subway downtown and eat at Lincoln's Waffle House for breakfast. We'll start the day at Lincoln's Waffle House, then move over to Ford's Theater before heading to Petersen's home. The only thing original on the Ford Theater is the brick facade. The rest of the building is a replica which was finished in 1968. The theater is now part of the Park Service, and this is what it looked like shortly after the assassination. Most people wouldn't come there after the association, and so it had to be sold to the Park Service. And downstairs is a small museum where you can see such things as the suit Lincoln was wearing that night. Also, you can see a pillow from the Petersen House that's stained with his blood, the derringer that was used to shoot him, and also you can see here costume that he wore on the way to his first inauguration because they were going to kill him, and the hat he wore that night in the Smithsonian. Office seekers came from everywhere and were one of his problems. It looked like this in 1846 and aged rather rapidly. His wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, was with him, but they had left the children at home, including Tad. The play they were seeing was Our American Cousins, kind of like the Beverly Hillbillies in some ways. John Wilkes Booth was one of the most famous actors of the time period. His original plan was to kidnap Lincoln and take him to Richmond for ransom. The plan changed to an assassination after the second inaugural address. He was well known at the theater and spent some time in the bar next door before the assassination. 8 other people were convicted in conspiracy with him. Lewis Powell was supposed to kill Secretary of State William Seward, and although he injured him severely with a knife and 4 of his family members, he did not succeed in killing him. He was tried and hung. David Harold went with Powell to kill the Secretary of State and later acted as a guide for Booth as he fled. He was arrested with Booth at the bar. George Alderotz was to guide them through the marshes when they kidnapped the president, but later, as the plans changed, he was sent to kill the vice president, but got drunk instead and never showed up. Mary Surratt allowed them to use her boarding house as a plotting place and was a courier carrying various things. She was the first woman executed in the United States. Her son, John, was a courier for the Confederates, and he was in Canada at the time and therefore not arrested, even though he was one of the major conspirators. Michael O'Loughlin was a childhood friend of Booth who was recruited but never really did anything, so he turned himself in and he was imprisoned for life. Samuel Arnold had second thoughts, left D.C., but was implicated in papers found in Booth's room and was imprisoned for life. Dr. Mudrow was not very clear. He could have been just a country doctor that happened to have been there when Booth needed attention to his leg, but there was also evidence that he and Booth had known each other for some time. Edmund Spangler was an unusual case. He was a stagehand at the theater that Booth knew from his business there, and so when he asked him to watch his horse, he didn't see anything wrong with that. He did get a 6-year jail sentence, but was not killed. The date was April the 14th, 1865, and it was Good Friday that Lincoln was killed on. This is the presidential booth where he was shot. Now, the stage was not set up like this. This is an active theater that puts on several plays a year, and Come From Away is the current show showing, not what was showing when Lincoln was assassinated. There's no presidential security at that time, so when President Lincoln and Mary arrived, they sat down. One of her friends, Clara Harris, and Major Henry Rathbone, her fiancé, were with them.
Once the presidential party was seated, then the play on stage resumed. Act 3, Scene 2. Essentially, it was the last big moment of laughter before the play. And when the large crowds not only began laughing raucously, they were also stamping their feet on the wooden floors and clapping. John Wilkes Booth was able to use that crowd noise in order to muffle the sounds of the gunshot. He simply entered one of the doors near Abraham Lincoln. He fired the pistol at point-blank range. President Lincoln was shot 2 inches behind the left ear in the hair. The bullet probably lodged itself behind the bone of Abraham Lincoln's right eye socket. President Lincoln never spoke again. John Wilkes Booth dropped the gun. Major Rathbone, upon seeing the commotion, he jumped up from the couch in there and he attempted to grab Mr. Booth. Major Rathbone was stabbed in the upper left arm. His injury was also serious. Then John Wilkes Booth jumped from the box onto the stage. At some point that evening, John Wilkes Booth broke his leg. Most people believe that he broke it while jumping, but there is another story that goes that his horse fell on him later on that evening. John Wilkes Booth originated both of those answers. There was a single actor standing here when Mr. Booth landed. His name was Harry Hawk, but he simply backed away, confused. Upon correcting himself, John Wilkes Booth walked very deliberately center stage. He was still wielding the dagger, which he raised over his shoulder. Then he yelled out. John Wilkes Booth almost assuredly yelled a Latin phrase from the stage. The words that John Wilkes Booth yelled were, "Sic semper tyrannis." That is a reference to the most famous political assassination of all. That is a reference to the assassination of Julius Caesar. Upon saying those words, John Wilkes Booth fled backstage. He left out of the same door he'd entered much earlier. Only about a minute of time had elapsed between Mr. Booth pulling the trigger and his exit from the building. So Mr. Booth had turned his back to the audience and was fleeing when screams came from up there. John Wilkes Booth did slightly injure 2 other people, but he was able to escape on horseback.
After he was shot, to get him out of all the confusion in the theater, they tried to move him, but ran into a crowd in the street, and so somebody at the Petersen boarding house across the street motioned to them to come in there, and that's where they took him. We'll be going in there now.
I can tell you right now that this is where they brought the president after he was assassinated across the street at the Ford's Theater. It was the closest place where there was a bed. The doctors determined that the wound was mortal. He would not survive. They carried him right back to the hospital. And one of the tenants here motioned the group and said that there was a back bedroom that was available. So Lincoln would spend his last few hours here in Petersen House and pass the next morning at 7:22. The front parlor where you are now is where Mrs. Lincoln spent most of her time. The back parlor next to this is where they would start the investigation for who shot the president, and the last room that you go through is actually...
In this front parlor is where Mary Todd Lincoln waited for news about her husband and his condition. And then in the next parlor, this is where Secretary of War Edwin Stanton started the investigation and looking for the men who did this. This is where Secretary Stanton had his meeting. And next we head to the back parlor where Lincoln was laid across a bed to be examined by the doctors.
we do.
There was no question who had shot Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth was one of the most famous actors of his time, and everybody saw him fleeing. So they started looking for him immediately, even before Lincoln died. Funeral arrangements were being made soon after his death, even before the people were caught that had done this. It took them 12 days to catch up with John Wilkes Booth, and they caught up with him in a barn. He refused to give up and was shot and killed. David Harold was caught with him and later executed, along with Lewis Powell and George Alderotz, and Mary Surratt also died, the first woman ever executed in the United States. This is a stack of all the books written about Lincoln. And this brings us to the end of this video.